Welcome everybody to the CNHHE webinar series today. The Canadian Network for the Human Health and the Environment is hosted by the New Brunswick Lung Association. My name is Melanie Langell and I am the president of these organizations. Before we get started today, a couple of notes for CNHHE members. We did publish a newsletter this morning, and this information is on our website that CMP has given us some advanced notice of some publications coming up between October and December. Those are draft screening assessment reports for acids and bases, flame retardants, methylstyronated phenol, and also an approach for a subset of organic and inorganic substances prioritized under the chemicals management plan. So if you have expertise in those subjects and would be interested in providing some comments, please get in touch with us. We do have an honorarium program to reimburse you for your time committed to this endeavor. Our talk today is about PFAS compounds, perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, known as PFOS, perfluorooctanoic acid, known as PFOA, and related per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances, known as PFAS, are recognized by environmental practitioners and regulatory bodies around the world as compounds of environmental concern. These persistent chemicals are found widely in the environment. The ubiquity of these compounds in a wide range of environmental and biological matrices, compounded with their chemical properties and studies suggesting human toxicity, have resulted in increased public concern. In April of 2021, the Government of Canada published a notice of intent in the Canada Gazette considering activities that would address the broad class of PFAS. So CNHHE would like to thank Dr. Terry Obal from Bureau Veritas Laboratories for sharing their experience with us today. Today's presentation will provide a brief overview of the science around PFAS, including PFAS as contaminants of emerging environmental concern, exposure and toxicity, sampling and analysis considerations for soil, water, tissue, and air, treatment and remediation, what are the options, and the future of PFAS in the environmental marketplace. Dr. Terry Obal is Chief Science Advisor at Bureau Veritas Laboratories. Terry's mandate is to ensure that good science and its value are fully available to customers, regulators, and the public by providing technical representation, consultative support, and expert opinions. Dr. Obal has been integral in the development of the commercialization of robust, reliable, and defensible methods for the determination of per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances. He's frequently called upon by key environmental stakeholders in the United States and Canada, like us, to provide scientific input and expertise on PFAS. Terry has over 30 years of experience in analytical chemistry, laboratory management, and environmental chemical consulting. He is currently chair of the board of directors of the Ontario Environmental Industry Association and is an Ontario chartered chemist through the Association of the Chemical Profession of Ontario. So welcome, Terry, and thank you so much for spending your time with us today. I do want to add, this is a webinar function, so if you do have questions, I don't have the capability to let you turn your camera on. I don't think, maybe in there somewhere. So please use the chat function, not the Q&A, but the chat, and I will keep my eye on that. I have discovered that I can turn your microphone on if you want to speak with Terry directly. So if you have questions as we go ahead and put them in the chat and we can try to integrate them into the talk. Otherwise, we can open the floor for some questions at the end. And so without any further ado, I will step away and let you take it over, Terry. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Melanie, is my microphone working? Everybody can hear? Okay, well, listen, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Our marketing team wrote that. Like I say, thanks for introducing the topic. Let me just say that, you know, the interest in PFAS, which is an acronym for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, it's exploded. And it continues to escalate at an extraordinary pace. With that said, what I'll be presenting today is it's an overview of what I'll call the PFAS industry And I'll focus on some of the history around this class of compounds, some general concepts in terms of its chemical and physical behavior, why it's a special class of compounds. Talk a little bit about the toxicity of PFAS and some of the tools that are available for determining PFAS in a variety of matrices for a variety of needs, be it environmental, regulatory compliance, or for consumer product evaluation. That's an area that's growing with respect to PFAS. I'll say contamination, but in a lot of cases, PFAS was put there with a purpose. And then finally, I'll provide some thoughts on kind of where the market is going. And as I was telling Melanie at the beginning when we were offline, is it's going to continue growing. The interest in PFAS is continuing to grow, and it's something that will people will be looking at for some time. So let me begin by, when you think of PFAS, it's been referred to as emerging contaminants. Funny thing is, we've known about PFAS for a long time. I think they're more appropriately called compounds of emerging environmental concern. So when you think PFAS, it's been around for a long time. Teflon was actually used as part of the Manhattan Project. It was first discovered in the late 1930s by Dr. Roy Plunkett at DuPont. And quite by accident, I might add. He was doing work trying to come up with a new coolant, a new Freon, and he was using tetrafluoroethylene gas, and under certain conditions, it polymerized. And he couldn't figure out where it went, so he sawed open the gas cylinder, and he found it was coated with this white waxy material, which was Teflon. So when the U.S. was developing the hydrogen bomb, they found that things like rubber O-rings and seals were degrading and were failing. So they approached DuPont and said, "Look, we got this problem. Our O-rings are failing. Do you have a solution for us?" And DuPont said, "Maybe." And it turns out he started to get things like Teflon O-rings because it was very robust and very resistant to degradation. So, I mean, that's a little bit of anecdotal history on Teflon, which is, and I'll speak to this later, is actually a polymeric mixture of PFAS. But let's talk about the general concepts. PFAS. These things are anthropogenic. They're man-made. Contamination that we find in the environment or that we find in people, Mother Nature didn't put it there. We did. It encompasses, it's a group of compounds. It encompasses more than 5,000 substances that have carbon and fluorine. It's a diverse range of compounds and with a variety of chain lengths and different end groups. They're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. The use of PFAS has been so prolific since its discovery. Or since they first started being manufactured and on a large scale, that it's everywhere. And the interest in PFAS really started to ramp up, to escalate, when they started finding it in people. And almost universally, if you test your blood now, you probably find PFAS. So the compounds receiving the most attention were PFOS and PFOA. And I'll speak a little bit about the acronyms in a second, but perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, or perfluorooctane sulfonate, and perfluorooctanoic acid. But, and the interest grows, and they start looking at some additional compounds, the C6, the hexane sulfonic acid, or the C9, the nonanoic acid. It's a plethora of substances. And what I call the up-and-comers, things like PFOA and PFOS are recognized to be hazardous and toxic, although, I'll speak to this, the toxicity information is still what I call elusive. But the manufacturers have agreed to phase these compounds out and eliminate them. But they still provide some advantages when formulated into different materials. So they're what are called replacement compounds, and these are the shorter chain PFAS that have 4 carbons versus the 8 carbons that you would have in an octanoic acid. So they're calling them PFAS replacement compounds, and they're coming up with great names like GenX, which is that's something I'll talk about a little later. These are, they would have us believe are less toxic, but the studies are showing that no, they're probably just as toxic, if not more so than the other compounds. From a chemical and physical properties standpoint, these things are surfactants, and that's kind of what makes them advantageous. They have a hydrophobic end, an end that doesn't like water, and a hydrophilic end, an end that does like water. And so they tend to, interact at the interfaces, at like a water-air interface. But that's what makes them special. They tend to repel water or repel oil, depending on how they're formulated. But the other thing to consider is that these things are really, really stable and persistent. They don't degrade. That carbon-fluorine bond, the atomic bond, is one of the strongest atomic bonds. So there's tremendous stability under heat and chemical stress. And this is why they're used primarily in firefighting foams, or historically have been used in firefighting foams. They're not really volatile. They're soluble in water. They tend to bind to a variety of materials, and it's hard to predict that partitioning. So that's what makes them challenging to analyze. But they do bioaccumulate, and they bioaccumulate not so much like pesticides that will accumulate in the adipose tissues, in the fatty tissues of the body. These things have been shown to stick to proteins. So think protein-rich organs, things like the liver, the blood, right? That's where you're going to find accumulation of PFAS, and the half-lives, depending on the structure, can be a long time. But some can degrade and transform into other PFAS. So it's really the technical vernacular. The clinical term is it's a dog's breakfast of compounds and challenges. I'll go through some of the conventions. PFAS is an umbrella term that includes 5,000 plus poly and perfluorinated compounds. PFAS is a plural noun. It's like moose, right? You have many moose, so you have many PFAS, and so that's sometimes difficult for people. We all started saying PFASs, PFAS compounds, et cetera. It's just PFAS. The trend is to report as the acid versus the conjugate. As I said at the beginning, perfluorooctane sulfonate is the conjugate, whereas perfluorooctane sulfonic acid is the acid form. But it's important to understand the two names, because people use them interchangeably. They are effectively the same thing, because these things are in equilibrium in solution. Perfluorinated means that all of the carbons in the backbone, like the PFOS, this is perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, but the conjugate, is saturated with fluorines. Polyfluorinated, these are compounds that not all the carbons are attached to fluorine, and they're often represented as precursor compounds that can transform to the perfluorinated end products. So, having given you that background on some of the behavior, now when you think PFAS, nonstick cookware, right? The Teflon cookware, they have incorporated PFAS, different formulations, because they repel oil and water. So your eggs, your fried eggs aren't going to stick to your pan. Food packaging, okay, think of the microwave popcorn, buttered popcorn. So if the butter soaks into the package, it is going to fall apart, and you've got a mess. So what they did, and they are eliminating it from food packaging, is they incorporated PFAS because it repels the oil and maintains the structural integrity of the packaging. French fries, hamburgers, etc. You know, and thankfully there's no label on these fries, so I don't get sued. But yeah, the greasy fries or the greasy hamburgers, if the grease were to soak into the material, it would fall apart and you have a mess. Aluminum foil has been known to be a source of PFAS because you have a shiny side and you have a dull side. The shiny side typically has a very, very thin layer of coating so that it doesn't stick. And just because I've been doing this for a long time and I did my graduate work looking at things like PCBs, aluminum foil, they used to use PCBs to do that. So I guess they replaced the PCBs with PFAS. Smiling guy in a jacket. No, that's not it. It is the coat that he's wearing, Gore-Tex. Gore-Tex was impregnated with, or PFAS was used in the manufacture of Gore-Tex because it repels the water. The water will beat up and just slide right off. So again, an important consideration. Scotchgard that you would spray on furniture or on carpets. Again, it repels material. But the primary source is going to be the AFFF. It's an acronym that you'll see in the PFAS space all the time. It is aqueous film forming foams. Okay, sometimes people call it aqueous firefighting fluids, aqueous firefighting foams. Suffice to say, AFFF is the primary source of contamination. Why? Because the carbon and fluorine do not break down under heat, if you recall the previous slide, and the foam smothers the fire. It basically, if you think of a pumper truck, it's got a small tank with concentrated AFFF, and it's got a big tank of water. And so when the two mix in the hose and it's aerated, you get a foam. And that foam covers the fire and smothers it. And it's because of the robustness of that carbon fluorine bond. So why do we care? Well, you know, it's the prolific use. Over time, we're starting to pay the piper. And you're finding high levels around military bases. The stores of AFFFs at military bases on both sides of the border are substantial. Paper composting facilities. Residents are now starting to sue the manufacturers. They're starting to sue. I was asked to participate in a class action. I had to back off because of potential conflict of interest, but they are naming everybody in these class action lawsuits. And the dollars are starting to get to be substantial, where 3M paid $850 million to settle a lawsuit in Michigan, while the original request was in the billions. And you know, at the end of the day, you know, what is our obligation is to protect the public. And the fact is that PFAS is a contaminant. It's ubiquitous, and it is certainly impacting the public. I do want to differentiate. You'll hear terms like fluoropolymers and fluorinated telomers. And fluoropolymers are long chain molecules, they're fire resistant, et cetera. And they're, you know, they are formulated into different mixtures in different combinations to elicit a particular behavior. Fluorinated telomers, these are surfactant surface treatment chemicals, repellent coatings on textiles. These are high performance surfactants that need to flow evenly, et cetera. But the fluorinated telomers, as I said before, they throw in an oxygen, or they will replace some of the fluorine with hydrogens, and it's just to develop different behaviors. As I said, naming conventions are important. Rather than using the C8 compound, this is the C4. It's referred to as perfluorobutanoic acid. Sometimes it's referred to as perfluorobutanoate. Sometimes it's referred to as perfluorobutyric acid. They're all the same. Okay, so when you see perfluorobutanoic acid, some people will call it perfluorobutanoate. These things exist in equilibrium. in solution, like in water. You know, some of it in the acid form, some of it in the conjugate form. But you know, we always get the question. You know, my client is asking that we test for perfluorobutanoate, and your list has perfluorobutanoic acid. Well, it's the same thing. The interest in PFAS, and you know, I'm going to throw you know, some structures at you. So I apologize if oh, I'll make chemists out of you. That this describes the history of the growth of interest in PFAS. But by doing so, my intent here is to, you know, to demonstrate that the scope and complexity of the problem with this class of compounds and what it presents for analysts and stakeholders, and why, you know, the federal government issued that notice of intent to study PFAS as a class rather than as individual compounds, because of the scope and the complexity of the problem. So first of all, PFAS, like I say, refers to this class of compounds, and where it began many years ago was with these two compounds, PFOA and PFOS, as Melanie said at the beginning, perfluorooctanoic acid and perfluorooctane sulfonic acid. Now, I've identified them as Teflon and Scotchgard. They are not Teflon and Scotchgard. That was a way that people could relate to perfluorooctanoic acid. Nobody's going to know what perfluorooctanoic acid is, but everybody knows what Teflon is. Perfluorooctanoic acid is a building block in the industrial manufacture of Teflon, and that's why they related it to Teflon. PFOS is found in Scotchgard. And so, you know, it makes a better news story if, you know, researchers are finding Teflon in polar bears rather than perfluorooctanoic acid. So, like I say, just recognize that those were used simply to make the compounds relatable. But very quickly, people started to recognize, hey, it's more than just those two compounds. There are other PFAS of different chain lengths. So we talked about the perfluorobutanoic acid, the C4 version, and the perfluorononanoic acid, where you have 9 carbons. Well, you have C10, C11, C12 versions of this, and you can see how that scope begins to increase quickly. They started to recognize that, oh, some of the bigger compounds with the different functionalities attached to it, they're precursors. They can over time transform and not degrade, but basically break down to the end products, the very recalcitrant, the ones that don't break down in the environment or in people. These things will transform into them. So they started looking at precursor compounds. As I said, replacement compounds are a big deal now, because the industry has pretty much said, oh, okay, Houston, we got a problem. PFOA is, you know, from a toxicity standpoint, is not looking good, but we've got a whole business around PFOA. So we're going to eliminate PFOA. We've got to replace it with something. Well, this is where GenX comes in, or Adana, just essentially their replacements for PFOA. One is 3M, the other is DuPont. Ultimately, that ends up, when you start looking at holistically this group of compounds that have fluorine, different functionalities, it's at 5,000 plus compounds, and folks like Jennifer Field out of the Oregon State University, or Chris Higgins at the Colorado School of Mine, they're continuing to characterize more and more compounds. So it is quite the challenge. What are the major sources of PFAS impact? Fire training and response sites. So all of the airports have firefighting training facilities. All of the Department of Defense bases on both sides of the border, they have huge inventories of these AFFFs. And anywhere where you've had a fire that was put out using one of these AFFF formulations, you have the risk of an environmental consequence, is what the lawyer told me to say one time. But the point is, airports are all over this. The Department of National Defense, the Department of Defense in the US, they're all over this because they have been using fluorinated PFAS formulations of AFFF for a long, long time. But industries are a direct source of PFAS. So you think of the Chemours plant in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Chemours is an offshoot company of DuPont. I say, rather cynically, that DuPont was trying to separate themselves from the PFAS issue. So, all right, create another company. But they have known to have been dumping compounds like GenX into the Cape Fear River. 3M is another direct producer and direct source of PFAS impact in the environment. But Canada, I mean, people ask about Canada. Why is Canada slow to regulate these things? Well, we're not a manufacturer. But what we do need to consider are third-party manufacturers that will buy PFAS from 3M or DuPont or any of the other 8 global suppliers and introduce PFAS into their products. And that's where I think the Canadian market needs to sort of stand up and take notice. Wastewater treatment plants are known, and there's increasing interest on wastewater treatment plants being a substantial source or a significant source of PFAS into the environment. As I said before, these things tend to absorb onto solids, biosolids, that, if you have PFAS in a wastewater treatment plant, the biosolids are, I'm not going to say precipitated, but they're separated from the water. Oftentimes, biosolids are sold to the farmers because, they're used as fertilizer. So is what's in the biosolids being introduced into the agricultural world? Landfills.
For you, Terry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt, and I encourage anybody to ask questions in the chat, and I can interrupt Terry at your whim. Question based on the absorption onto biosolids: is PFAS something that's routinely tested for in wastewater effluent?
Not yet. Not yet. It's getting there. The U.S. is a little bit more active in regulating these, but it's not part of, as far as I'm aware, any municipal sewer use bylaw. So that is what it dictates the discharge from industry into a municipal, into a sanitary sewer system. They haven't changed them. PFAS isn't included. I suspect that, mind you, I haven't seen any, that when you have a certificate of approval issued by the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks to build a wastewater treatment facility, they might start including it, but as yet, no. Biosolids, though, there's a huge interest in testing biosolids for PFAS.
And what about drinking water quality standards? Drinking water quality standards,
Health Canada has guidance values. I'll talk a little bit about those because in Atlantic Canada, the Rebecca Environmental Quality Standards just in July, they have pretty much adopted the Health Canada guidance values for their environmental quality standards for potable water. The other, depending on the different tiers and pathways, they may be a little bit more relaxed, but for potable water, they have just adopted Health Canada guidance. I think the other provinces are going to follow suit. British Columbia was the first province to regulate PFAS, and they just regulated 3 compounds: PFOS, PFOA, and perfluorobutane sulfonic acid, so PFBS. And PFBS is only in drinking water. But I suspect the other provinces are going to follow suit. Ontario may be a little bit slower because we've got an election coming up. So,
okay, great, thank you. I'll disappear again now.
No problem. Please, and I encourage those. I'm very informal. If you have any questions, feel free to send them to Melanie, and we'll deal with them as they come up. So let's talk a little bit about toxicity. Toxicologists have, don't necessarily conduct their studies in a harmonized fashion. So I think the toxicity information, it's demonstrating that there's a substantial risk and toxicity to certain compounds, but it's still, that direct cause and effect is it's still somewhat elusive. PFAS may pose potential for adverse human health effects because of toxicity, mobility, and this bioaccumulation potential in the protein-rich organs. But as I was saying before, these replacement compounds using PFBS is a replacement compound for some of the longer chain PFAS. And as I said, the manufacturers would have us believe that it's less toxic and therefore it poses less of a risk. And from my standpoint, I look at it, the studies are showing, well, no, it may be just as toxic, but even if it is less toxic, it is more soluble and therefore more mobile than the higher molecular weight, longer chain compounds. So taking into consideration those effects, which poses the greater risk, right? Because the shorter chain compounds are going to travel much more extensively than the longer chain compounds. But that's again, that's the world according to Obal. Suffice to say, the longer chain PFAS have long half-lives in the body, anywhere from 2 to 9 years. In terms of the potential human toxic effects, they're still kind of inconsistent and inconclusive, but they're certainly suggestive of PFAS toxicity. IARC has classified PFOA, that's the C8 carboxylic acid, so perfluorooctanoic acid, as a possible carcinogen. EPA has concluded that both PFOS and PFOA are possibly carcinogenic. The toxicologists have agreed that there needs to be a harmonization in the study protocols if we're going to get consistent toxicological data. Having said that, if you go back in time, as far back as 1950, studies have shown that there is a toxic effect of bifluorinated chemicals. Going back to the 50s and 60s, mice and rats didn't like this stuff. In 1950, there was a study done by 3M that said that PFAS builds up in the blood. In 1966, 3M finds that PFAS causes acute oral toxicity in rats. Now, I sometimes wonder about acute oral toxicity. How much did they feed the rats? But nonetheless, it's not looking good. 1970, DuPont says PFAS is highly toxic when inhaled. So now, do we have methods to analyze air? 1978, 3M concludes that PFOS, PFOA, the stuff that's used to make Teflon should be regarded as toxic. This is coming from the manufacturers. 3M, they did a study and they found elevated cancer rates among their workers. And again, more negative reports, and that these are, like I say, coming from the manufacturers. This one I found kind of compelling. In 1999, a 3M scientist describes PFOS as the most insidious pollutant since PCBs. So I think it's pretty fair to say that these things are bad, and we need to be looking for them. So what have we learned from a sampling standpoint? From an environmental standpoint, but from any sampling standpoint, you have to have strict and rigorous sampling protocols so that it is defensible from a legal standpoint. But remember the ubiquity of these compounds. They're everywhere, right? So you need to make sure that any containers that you use are free of PFAS, that they're not contributing extraneous contamination to the samples. And why that's important is the levels that are being measured in water, in soil, are at the part per trillion level. And so to put that into perspective, this is what labs do. We routinely analyze compounds at the part per billion level. And I use the analogy of time to put it into perspective. 1 part per billion is 1 second out of a billion seconds. So if you do the math on that, that's 1 second out of 31.7 years. That's what we're measuring routinely and reliably and defensively. Now you're going 3 orders of magnitude lower. You're measuring at the part per trillion level. So again, do the math, and I did. That's 1 second out of 32,000 years. And I always like to throw in our dioxin laboratory. We do polychlorinated dibenzo P dioxin. So 2378 TCDD is it is a known carcinogen, very, very toxic, that we're required to analyze and quantify at the part per quadrillion level. So that laboratory is measuring seconds in 32 million years. So I find that impressive, but it underscores the need for ensuring that your environment and the samples and the materials that you use are PFAS free. And recognize that absorption onto surfaces is important. So don't transfer samples from one container to the next, because you're losing a certain portion of the sample or of the compounds that you're measuring. So now the result coming out of a laboratory, it'll be correct, but it will not be representative of the environment that you collected it from. And so, like I say, I'm using the environmental samples as an example, but this can apply to any type of sample that you're testing for PFAS. You have to consider, is it representative? Now, historically, people were, if we've got PFAS in deodorants or in soaps or in shampoos, if you're going out to collect samples, do not shower 3 or 4 weeks before collecting the sample. That's a little extreme. And through years of experience now, environmental stakeholders are taking a more common sense approach. Let's consider what is coming in contact with the sample, et cetera. So things that are waterproof probably contain PFAS, right? Remember, repels water or repels oil. Certain detergents that are used, Decon 90 is something that's used in the field. It's a known container. It contains PFAS. So there are now acceptable items that are in various sampling manuals, and they're saying things that you're just not sure about. Off-brand markers. We've tested Sharpies. Sharpies do not contribute PFAS, but others may. And so in cases like that, if you're not sure, you check with the laboratory. Just keeping an eye on the time. Talk a little bit about the PFAS toolkit. And testing for PFAS, because, as I said, we're trying to get our head around 5,000 plus compounds. So initially, there's this technology, it's liquid chromatography with tandem mass spectrometry, and you're looking for individual PFAS, individual compounds. But the problem is the scope of that test, the list of compounds is probably anywhere from 40 to, I think Eurofins in the US is offering 75 compounds out of 5,000. So it's important to be able to test for those compounds at really low levels, but what about the other 4,925 compounds? So people started developing tests looking at total oxidizable precursors. So not only are you looking at the individual compounds in the first square, you are trying to get an idea of the other PFAS compounds by it's sort of an iterative process looking at the breakdown of these precursor compounds. Then there's total organic fluorine, and there are different approaches. You can use neutron activation analysis. The challenge there is you need a nuclear reactor. We have access to one. Actually, we use McMaster University's nuclear reactor. So that's an approach to looking at the overall picture, and by not looking at individual PFAS compounds, but if you have organic fluorine in your sample, odds are it's PFAS. I mean, organofluorine compounds, there aren't many of them. I mean, there's some agrochemicals, there's some pharmaceutical compounds, but in the environmental space, are you likely to find those? So if you look at organic fluorine and get a value for it, can you use that to determine total organic fluorine? You have what's called particle-induced gamma ray emission, is PIGGY. And PIGGY is another approach similar to neutron activation analysis. Problem is, there's only 2 or 3 academic laboratories that are doing it. And so we have now commercialized what's called total organic fluorine by combustion ion chromatography. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to go through these, but very quickly, what's important to understand about them is their application. So when we think of PFAS by LCM SMS, there's a whole process that the samples have to go through. The point is, in the laboratory, it's the same as in the field. Eliminate all sources of contamination, because if something contaminates your sample, the value is correct, but it's not representative. And from the data user standpoint, it's kind of useless. There are tricks in the laboratory, isotope dilution, because these things stick to walls. Isotope dilution is a must, and liquid chromatography with tandem mass spectrometry. So if you're ever in a position where you're requiring, you need to determine PFAS concentration in whatever matrix, isotope dilution, LCM SMS. Those are the recognized best practices in the industry. The thing to note here is the levels being reported. In water, we are at the subpart per trillion level for detection limits. Reporting limits are just above the part per trillion. And why I differentiate the two from a laboratory standpoint and in terms of interpreting results, a detection limit is a statistically derived value that you can confidently say, you can with 99% certainty say, my instrument response is something different from 0, period. If you can quantify it, but the variability on that value is huge. So that's why a reporting limit is not only you confident that it's something different from 0, you have a certain confidence interval around the value being reported. And so that leads to reproducibility, reliability, and defensibility. Now, why is this important? It is from a regulatory standpoint. If you look at the concentrations, micrograms per liter is a part per billion. So I just use water as an example. And you can see where the concentrations are going. This is now 20 parts per trillion. So that's 20 seconds out of 31.7 or 31,000 years, or 32,000 years. That's significant from a laboratory standpoint, because it makes it that much more challenging to collect a representative sample and to analyze it reliably. Other jurisdictions are following suit. They're going lower, and like I say, there's still not total agreement on the toxicity. So the question is, what's driving the regulatory standards? I'll also note that certain jurisdictions are starting to regulate the replacement compounds as well as the PFAS. And logically, it's North Carolina, and that's because of the Chemours plant in Fayetteville. Total oxidizable precursors, as I said, it's an iterative process. You're doing the LCM SMS analysis twice. Okay, so it's known that the higher molecular weight complex compounds will transform over time. So this is just an approach where you're accelerating that transformation. So you analyze the sample once, get your list of compounds, and then you oxidize it using a strong oxidant, which is supposed to model how it's behaving in situ, but just a whole lot faster. And then you analyze it again and you look for differences. And why that's important is this is an actual redacted report for the total oxidizable precursors. We analyze if for pre-oxidation concentrations, we analyze for this list of compounds, could be used for regulatory compliance. It is what is in your sample. And if you'll notice, these two compounds here, the 6,2 and the 8,2 fluorotelomere sulfonate. They're there in substantial concentrations in your sample. Now you oxidize your sample and you reanalyze it. And what happens? If you'll notice, these compounds, these precursors, have disappeared. But look what's happened to the lower molecular weight carboxylates. They have increased substantially. So what that tells us, and more so than what would have been, you know, if you did a mass balance between these two and these concentrations, what it's telling us is there is something else in your sample that is PFAS, but is not included in the target list of compounds. And these are why these tests like the total oxidizable precursors or total organic fluorine become very, very important. So I'm going to stop here and talk a little bit about this dark matter, what I call dark matter. So as I said, PFAS analyses typically report anywhere from 20 to 50. Like I say, Eurofins has come out with 75 in the US. And it's well understood that there are thousands of these compounds. So most are, and most of them, they haven't been characterized. This is the dark matter. And so, as I said, it can break down or transform and contribute toxicity risk beyond what's identified by the originally reported PFAS compounds. So how do you accurately assess risk or in, you know, site assessment and remediation, the remedial effort? TOPS, total oxidizable precursors, gives you a glimpse, but it's not fully quantitative. There's still some, it's not a panacea, okay? And in fact, in over 30 years in this industry, I don't believe in panaceas, but if you start combining tests, they start to tell you a story. So how do you address that? Well, look at the total organic fluorine. And so this is combustion ion chromatography, where basically, I said carbon fluorine, really, really robust atomic bond. Well, if you heat the sample up to above 1,000 degrees, to 1,100 degrees, now you will break that bond and you will mineralize the sample and form fluorine, which is then trapped in a fluid and then measured by ion chromatography. It's very, very elegant. It's very, you know, it's not as expensive as having a nuclear reactor or the Piggy apparatus. Again, technical term, easy peasy. But why it's important, and this was a study done by von Abercron, and he looked at wastewater. And if you look at this this histogram, this bar chart, the dark bars, that is the sum of the PFAS that was measured by liquid chromatography and tandem mass spectrometry. So looking just at those target compounds and calculating what the fluorine concentration would be from them, so the fluorine burden. Then he did total organic fluorine by ion chromatography. That's the gray bars. So what's important to note here is that the total organic fluorine in the wastewater was typically 100 times higher than what would have been suggested if you relied only on the individual compounds. So again, going back to the notice of intent out of the federal government about looking at it as a class may be something to consider. I'll go over this slide here, but basically they're not, total organic fluorine and PFAS results are not directly relatable. You have to consider that PFOS, when you get 250 nanograms per liter of this compound, that results in 162 nanograms per liter. The theoretical is only 162 nanograms per liter of fluorine. And so if you look at real world samples, yep, here's a groundwater sample. We measured these three compounds by liquid chromatography with tandem mass spectrometry. The sum, 25.7, go ahead, call me gifted. But the calculated organic fluorine from these three compounds is really, it's only 10 micrograms per liter. Measuring it by total organic fluorine using combustion ion chromatography, we end up with 23. So it's an increase of 2.3. So that's telling us we're not capturing all of the PFAS in our target list of compounds. It becomes more compelling, some of these other samples that in this monitoring well, it's a groundwater sample, so potential drinking water, if it's in a rural area. The PFAS by LC-MS-MS, looking at individual compounds, only gave 4.6 micrograms per liter and a theoretical fluorine of 4. We measured 50. So there's a bunch of other stuff that we're not measuring. This one here I always like because this is an AFFF. And because of dilution, we only measured the one compound, 53,000 parts per billion. Calculated organic fluorine is almost 31,000. We measured well over 2.5 million parts per billion, which makes total sense because Petrosil 3%, when they have like an Ansel 3% or a Petrosil 3%, what that's telling you is it's probably 3% PFAS in this concentrate. So I mean the test does work. So go back to this slide here with the plethora of compounds. LC-MS-MS gives you a limited view. It gives you the target compounds. It's really good for regulatory compliance because the regulators right now are regulating individual compounds. But if you need to know, are there other impacts that could result in future liability? You look at something like the TOPS assay, it gives you an indication that, you know, there's something over and above the target compounds. And total organic fluorine looks at the big picture, looks at everything, but it is not selective. It does not give you concentrations of individual compounds. So they all have a different purpose. They have different advantages and limitations, but I'm going to skip to this one. You know, when to use one over the other if you're trying to comply with regulations, because the regulators will set standards for individual compounds. You want to look at individual compounds. If you're trying to characterize a site and a site could be a property, a site could be a person. If you're trying to characterize what PFAS is in that system, again, you're looking at individual compounds. You may want to look at the TOPS assay because the first analysis gives you the individual compounds. The second analysis gives you a glimpse, an indication of other compounds that may be present. Contaminant delineation, same thing. You want to be very selective and specific. These tell you that there is other contamination. If you're measuring PFOS, the individual compound, and you come to a point where there's no more PFOS, if you do TOPS and TOF, it'll tell you, is there other stuff that you're not considering that could, over time, result in potential liability. As I said before, completion of cleanups, you want to look at everything. Risk, you want to look at individual compounds, but you need to have an idea of other PFAS. This one is kind of important because we're getting a lot of interest on consumer products. Certain consumer products that, feminine hygiene products. If you think about it, you know, in some cases you want them to repel water, in some cases you don't want them to repel water. Well, the Sierra Club did a study on a certain supplier of some of the newer, trendier feminine hygiene products, and they said there's PFAS in them. So now there's an awful lot of interest. Well, the total organic fluorine approach provides an interesting, way of determining if there's no organic fluorine, there's no PFAS. The challenge with total organic fluorine by CIC right now, although we're doing, we're doing a lot of research on it, getting the limit of detection or the reporting limit down to the same levels as the individual compounds. It is still not as sensitive as LC-MS-MS. Where's the market going? This is just a map of the US. Pulled this out of a survey that was done. And in 2019, there were about 1,400 sites in the United States. This is the number of sites and the density of sites is going to grow significantly based on this study. The interest in compounds. We're always interested in what is contaminating the environment and ultimately will impact people. And historically, it's things like hydrocarbons, metals, PCBs, etc. Based on this study, the interest is in PFAS and other emerging contaminants. 1,4-dioxane There's another one. If you ever want, I can come back, talk to you about 1,4-dioxane. That one is getting a lot of attention because it's showing up in groundwater systems in the United States where they wouldn't have expected it. So there are other sources of 1,4-dioxane. The people that are looking at the anticipated remediation costs for PFAS, and this is really just to demonstrate to you the interest in these compounds. $160 billion in the US over the next 5 or so years. That's cradle to grave. That is characterization of the problem, delineation of the problem, and then treatment of the problem. But that's really a loaded one because they really don't have a good way of treating these compounds. Well, check. Treating versus remediating. You can remediate a groundwater system. You pump out the water, put it through activated carbon, and that removes the PFAS. So out of the tail end of the treatment system, you have clean water. But all you've done is repackage the problem. You have now carbon that is contaminated with PFAS. It's more manageable. And the only way really to get rid of PFAS, and it's the basis for the combustion ion chromatography, is high temperature incineration. Same with dioxins. And the problem is that we are decommissioning more incinerators than we are building. But you can see the people who are going to be spending an awful lot of money on this are manufacturing sites. So these guys like Chemours in North Carolina, 3M in Michigan, but the Department of Defense, they're all over this because of the huge, huge inventories and stores of AFFF. Airports are certainly going to be focused on this over the next while. There's also what I call the the court of public opinion. For those that are interested, Netflix has a documentary. It's called The Devil We Know, and it speaks directly to PFAS and PFAS contamination in the environment. It is, certainly it provides one perspective on it. And hey, we made the big screen. Dark Waters with Mark Ruffalo is, I'm sure you can find it on cable, but it speaks to really the outing of DuPont and the impacts that PFAS had on the public, and they made it exciting. I encourage you, Netflix for The Devil We Know, and I'm not sure where I saw Dark Waters. So where does the future need? We need tests for air. Air is becoming very important, particularly ambient air and industrial hygiene. Biosolids, we talked about those, and there was the question asked about biosolids. Tissue, we are actively working on methods here. Total organic fluorine, we are the first commercial laboratory in North America to offer total organic fluorine by combustion ion chromatography. Eurofins now offers it in the US. But the remedial technologies, it is still people, that's the holy grail here, is figuring out what do you do with this stuff once you've identified and characterized the contamination. But the other one that's becoming very interesting is PFAS forensics. Because of all these compounds, different formulations, if you understand the behavior of these compounds, both from a chemical standpoint and from a physical standpoint, so fate and transport in the environment, is there a forensic angle here? And yes, people are looking at different approaches to try and trace back the source of PFAS contamination, because many years ago, PFAS was identified as a compound of emerging environmental concern. It's that proverbial Houston, we have a problem scenario. Then there's been a lot of work characterizing and delineating. So this is, what is it, where is it, and how much is there? And remediation and treatment, what do we do with it? Well, what you're seeing now is litigation and subrogation. Subrogation is the insurance companies who have to underwrite remedial options. Insurance companies don't like to lose. And so, they will pay to remediate a site, but they want to get their money back. So they're going to want to know who's responsible, and more importantly, who's going to pay. So there are different tools that are available and up and coming. And if you're interested, certainly feel free to reach out to me. Resources. If you really are interested, there are a lot of good resources. I've just pulled a few. The ITRC has had a working group on PFAS for a number of years now, and if you go to the ITRC website, they have a number of fact sheets that speak to the history, to treatment, to toxicity in far more detail than I've presented here. And just recently, they have updated those. US EPA, they have their action plan for per and polyfluoralkyl for PFAS. That has been updated as of 2020. There was this Environmental Business Journal from 2019, if you're interested in where the market's going. And certainly, the Canadian, the federal government has, an abundance of material online that provide a lot more detail to what I've just shared with you. I have to acknowledge I do this simply because I get the fun of going out and presenting, but there's people that they're the ones who do all the work, and I always want to recognize particularly Adam Robinson and the operations, validating methods and getting the results out. We certainly have project managers in Laurie Dufour and Stephanie Paulin, and Dr. Heather Lord and her group. Looking at research and development, they were instrumental in commercializing the combustion ion chromatography method. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to contact Stephanie or myself at those coordinates. And with that, I apologize. I've gone a little bit over time and probably rushed some of it. But like I say, for the sake of brevity, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, thank you, Terry, for that broad overview of PFAS and lots of different facets of where we find it and where we are going forward. And so on behalf of the CNHHE, Terry, I thank you very much for taking the time to share your experience with us today. And thank you to all the attendees that took the time out of their day to learn a little bit more about PFAS today. And we will anxiously await the assessment reports coming from federal government under the Chemicals Management Plan, and look forward to opportunities to be involved in the process. So with that, I'll say goodbye, everybody. Thank you for being here. Be well.
And thank you for again the opportunity, and I thank those listeners for the their patience. Do appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Terry. Bye now.
Okay, Melanie, we will talk soon.